Hi guys, Joe here, and welcome to 750 Gaming. In this one we'll revisit my inquisitorial Red Hunters and discuss how I'm souping up some Space Marines in 10th edition. Alright, so back in the middle of 9th edition I created a wonderfully fluffy Red Hunters Space Marine army, and you can go watch that original video now and have a look at some of my early work, should you wish. But for those not necessarily in the know, here's a quick summary. The Red Hunters are a Space Marine chapter of unknown genesis. They were a second founding chapter for sure, but no one really knows which Primarch's gene seed forms the basis of their DNA. It is most likely, and therefore assumed to be, that of the Lion, old L. Johnson of the Dark Angels himself, though of course there is little evidence for this. In fact, there's little lore, and that's to say canonical Black Library, Forge World or Codex fluff about the Red Hunters in general, which one makes them more mysterious and fun, and two means you can kind of go to town. As I mentioned, it is said that the Red Hunters were formed at the time of the second founding, in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, and formed specifically at the behest of the Inquisition to essentially operate as henchmen for the various ordos. Unlike the Deathwatch, whose ranks are made up of an array of veteran Space Marines essentially on secondment from their various home chapters, the Red Hunters are a fully fledged chapter proper, with the necessary resources to operate autonomously and independently, just as any other Codex compliant, or indeed uncompliant chapter, should they wish or require it. Historically, however, as per the reported nature of their founding, they have operated as subservient to the Inquisition and, if it ain't broke, what's to fix? Go figure. As such, they are one of the very few Space Marine chapters to adorn themselves with inquisitorial iconography, and when deployed it is mainly on specific Inquisition-ordered missions, their most high-profile deployment being that of the Siege of Vrax. Alternatively, when not in the fray, they can often be found forming an honour guard to respective high-ranking Inquisitor Lords as and when appropriate to do so. It's very fun, and with a deep red base colour and gold trimmings, they are fun to paint as well and look very cool on the table. Which is one of the main reasons I researched them and started my army back in 9th edition. It was also a time when you could field an Inquisitor in your various detachments quite flexibly and go to town with your own bit of inquisitorial Space Marine headcanon. That all got nuked and nerfed as we moved into the 9th edition Arcs of Omen endgame, and whilst I could still theoretically have fielded it all as a legacy army, with the way Games Workshop treated 9th edition towards the end, I didn't really want to, so the army got shelved. Quite literally. But then 10th edition landed a year or so ago, and all was well again, relatively speaking. But the agents of the Imperium are back, and the inquisitorial tabletop presence is reborn. Huzzah! So I got thinking about how I could really bring some further deeper fluff and creativity to this army, and a few different ideas came to mind. The first was to work out what 10th edition detachment rule set I was going to run these guys under. It would of course be totally appropriate, as a notionally Codex compliant chapter, to run them as a Gladius task force. But it felt a bit dull. So instead I decided maybe I'd look at running them as Deathwatch on the table and take advantage of all the fun and games that they can bring, and considering the Deathwatch got nerfed significantly and aren't as overpowered as they were at the beginning of the edition, I don't feel too dickish about doing this with a proxy-esque army. Of course, the Deathwatch predominantly operate under the Ordo Xenos. They are the alien hunters, so to speak. Whereas the Red Hunters, whilst being requisitionable by all the Ordos, predominantly team up with the Ordos Hereticus. But I think a lot of the stuff is going to be transferable. Certainly the intent and purpose, anyway. And whilst of course I could have just done a Deathwatch army proper and been done with it all, I've recently just rebuilt my Black Templars, and frankly I'm done with painting black power armour for the moment. So I thought I'd take artistic license here, and by doing so it opened up a few different options I hadn't previously considered. I'd already got my Inquisitor that I'd kit bashed, and it was actually one of my very first kit bashes actually, from an old Stormcast Knight Arcanum, and I'm actually really happy with how he looks still, compared to some of my more recent conversions. And as per the 10th edition rules, we can play Inquisitors again, and now attach them to Imperium battle line units. This is very good, because from that old edition army list, I've still got 10 intercessors. So I'll split them into 2 squads and pick one to become his bodyguard unit. Now, I must confess, when 9th edition went down the pan, taking this army with it, I ended up harvesting the majority of the units from this army to repurpose and use in some of my other Space Marine armies. Fortunately, I clearly hadn't found another use for my squad of Eliminators, and if we're on Inquisitorial Search and Destroy, or maybe Assassinate duties here, then camouflaged sniper rifle guys still fit the bill, but we'll come back to these in a moment. That was the starting point of this rebuild anyway, or rather, all that was left. But, good. What next? Well, I thought, let's look through the Deathwatch stuff and see what's of value. And I really like the thematic idea of having a Watchmaster and a Deathwatch Veteran squad combo. Now, the question is this actually a good combo? It feels like it should be. The Watchmaster can theoretically only attach to a Veteran squad or a Proteus kill team, so it should have some value. But it's a real toss-up between whether it is better, worse, or on par with a Sternguard Veteran squad and another character combo. Sternguard are pretty good since the latest field manual dropped their points a bit. Shooting wise, you're probably looking to take the super flexible Sternguard bolt rifles over the combi weapons, which just aren't as good. And you're probably going to take the heavy bolter over the pyre cannon. Their standard close combat weapon is actually pretty good for basic Space Marine melee capability here, and their punch can be maximised by giving the sergeant a power weapon, or indeed a fist. There's not a lot of flex, but you don't really need it or want it here. The Deathwatch vets, on the other hand, feel like they might be a bit suboptimal. Whilst my penchant for Primaris Tacticus armour would mean modelling mine as such, their data card is still based on the old school Core Marines, so by default they wield bolt guns. Not Primaris bolt rifles of any variant, no, just a simple bolt gun. No keywords, no AP, a bit underwhelming. On the flip side, they get to wield long vigil melee weapons as standard, which are essentially your standard power weapons. But because we're not Primaris here, these veterans only get 3 attacks with these weapons, whereas your standard Intercessor Sergeant is able to make 4 attacks with effectively the same weapon. Now you can upgrade that unexciting bolt gun to a long vigil ranged weapon. Unfortunately, that's just a fancy name for a combi weapon. It's the same profile as the Sternguard one, which, as already mentioned, is probably suboptimal. But I guess it is a bit better than an old school bolt gun. The problem being that if you did want to do that, then you have to lose the power weapons and take the generic Deathwatch close combat weapon instead. And though it's not necessarily the end of the world again, same stats as the Sternguard one, you just get 1 less attack per Marine, as per. But at least the Sergeant can gain back an extra attack and a devastating wound keyword by upgrading his melee weapon to a Xenophase blade. One upside is that the heavy bolter upgrade for the Deathwatch vets also has a heavy flamer weapon profile too, like an old school combi bolter, but heavy. So that's nice, but you'd be forgiven for thinking that this really doesn't make up for the rest of the data card. However, here's the power piece, and the reason I think I will take the Deathwatch vets over the Sternguard vets. 2 of your guys can forsake ranged weapons altogether and take Deathwatch Thunderhammers, which are very cool, and also make this squad a nice hybrid. They've got less shooting than a Sternguard squad, but more melee threat. Then, whilst they don't necessarily have the same punch as Blade Guard, they have more numbers and a bit more specialist shootingness. So here's my play. We attach a Watchmaster to a squad of Deathwatch vets, That squad then has 2 combi weapons, a heavy bolter and a vigil spear as its ranged weaponry, and then 2 thunder hammers, a xenophase blade, 2 close combat weapons, and the vigil spear again as its melee loadout. I think that's a nice mix, and I'll explain why in a bit. But without any official models in our possession, to the pile of potential and the bits box we went to see what we could come up with and what would fit the bill. The Watchmaster I'm very, very happy with. He is essentially a Primaris librarian at heart, or body, I suppose, with all manner of bits attached, and the Vigil Spear worked out far better than I thought it would. And I painted his left arm silver to homage the Deathwatch fluff. The veterans themselves, however, well, I did a few test models and things to see if I was going to be able to kit bash these. And the truth is that yes, I would be able to. But nothing looked as clean as I wanted it. And so to eBay I went to get a cheap squad of actual Sternguard vets from the Leviathan starter box, and I went to Etsy and got some third-party Thunder Hammers printed, and hey presto. I remodelled 2 Indomitus Lieutenant chaps from my bits box with the said hammers, and so essentially I now have 7 loincloth-adorned veteran-looking miniatures with assorted weapon loadouts, and from those 7 miniatures I can field that Deathwatch veteran squad as I intend to, but also a Codex Standard Sternguard veteran squad, if desired at any point. I then had the idea of maybe taking one of those Intercessor squads and adding some Hellblasters to their ranks to make a Fortis kill team. After all, I had half of a Hellblaster box from my Space Wolves army going spare, and so that's what I planned to do, as I felt like I wanted another Deathwatch specific unit in this army, and thought we could possibly do something to leverage that kill team keyword. But the more I thought about it and researched how I would make it work, I just couldn't justify it. I realised it was far better to keep those Intercessors as they were, and then have those Hellblasters separate again as their own unit. In a Fortis kill team, they lose their shoot again on death special ability, which is kind of their power piece and what really makes them proper gnarly. Okay. What actually makes them proper gnarly is to attach an apothecary to that squad, so that you can supercharge the plasma incinerators, die to the hazardous check, shoot again on death, and then with the apothecary bring them back to life to do it all over again. Now, don't tell me that's not one of the best combos ever. The caveat being that, of course, I didn't have an apothecary. Not to worry, I thought, we have some bits again. The pincer type thing came from some Chaos Havocs. I think it was for loading missiles into a launcher. The tabard and bits came from my Primaris Crusader squad sprues, and I had this idea to add this servo skull type thing. I guess he's looking a bit apothecary marini, that kind of thing. I'm pretty happy with him, if not necessarily the paint job. Who likes painting white? Ugh. But then I went a little off-piste. Part of my creative brain has been living in what-if land for a while now when it comes to this 40k thing, and I've been trying to do stuff that is just different from the norm, and of course, a bit unique. Hence that Space Wolves project previously. Anyway, I really like the Alpha Legion. Okay, stay with me here. I really enjoy how they are just super ambiguous and super mysterious. They've recently made a reappearance in the main story with all the Arcs of Omen stuff surrounding the Lion's return, and, well, I'm not entirely convinced about where their loyalties lie, and I'm still expecting the greatest double bluff in 40k history to come into Black Library prose at some point where we find out they were loyalist all along, or whatever. But I thought we'd play with that idea at any rate. What if they were loyal to the Imperium? Or, some of them were, or it at least served their purpose at any rate to present as such. You see where I'm going with this, I hope? I thought, say there were an loyalist retinue of Alpha Legion adorned Space Marines somewhere in the galaxy. Well, I imagine that the Inquisition would surely have their tendrils in play with that, so to speak, should this ever be the case. Or perhaps it's vice versa. Anyway, as such, I painted up some incognito dark blue infiltrators to, infiltrate in a very covert Alpha Legion-y way. I'll actually play them as incursors because I think they're a better unit in my opinion and they're cheaper points-wise, but that's by the by. I had thought about repainting those Eliminators in blue, as I figured I'd do all the Phobos Armoured Astartes in Alpha Legion colour schemes and all the normal Primaris dudes in Red Hunter colours, a nice division, but I didn't actually do too bad a paint job on them originally, and I'd run out of gas by the time I'd painted everything else up, so red they'll stay for now. But I did think that the Alpha Legion segment needed their own leader unit, so logically a lieutenant in Phobos armour fits the bill. But again, I didn't have any spare plain Phobos-y bits left, and I didn't fancy paying the lieutenant tax. But I did have a Phobos librarian in stock, so to speak, so go big or go home, I thought. Here's my Phobos lieutenant, who happens to look a lot like some guy called Cypher, but runs around the battlefield calling himself Alfarius. Now, I will forgive you for thinking, what the hell is this army? And it's definitely an appropriate question to ask. On the face of it, it's a right mess. It's a Deathwatch army that doesn't look much like a Deathwatch army, only really has one Deathwatcher unit, and is co-led by a suspected agent of chaos attached to a squad of random blue chaps with an ambiguous loyalty status. Well, welcome to the Inquisition, I guess. And yet more of my own heretical headcanon. But who said you couldn't do soup armies in 40k anymore? Thematically, at least. Because the final thing to cover is actual gameplay ability. It's not pure soup, I suppose. Lots of flavour, if lacking substance. Considering we're already a Deathwatch detachment, it's really just a discussion on what enhancements we want to throw on stuff. We have a fair bit of point headroom, technically enough for another unit, but instead we're going to take a hit on numbers on the table and pay for some shenanigans. We will take the Tome of Ectoclades on the Watchmaster, which explains the random library book he is carrying, being based on the librarian body. Huzzah! Happy accident! But this essentially gives us a secondary Oath of Moment target, which is pretty cool. With the Watchmaster attached to the Deathwatch Vets, despite being the only unit here that theoretically doesn't have an assault keyword on any of their ranged weapons, we can still move, advance and shoot with the strategic knowledge ability he possesses. So the play is to shoot at one of our Oath of Moment targets, if possible, and either we can use that to re-roll hits, considering most of their shooty weapons hit on a 4+, or before we shoot with this squad, we can shoot said target with one of the Incursor squads, utilising their multi-spectrum array ability to give anything subsequently shooting that target +1 to hit. The Watchmaster's strategic knowledge also then allows us to charge, so into the fray we go with all of our melee goodness. And hopefully, that's the idea anyway. We will throw Thief of Secrets on the cyber-esque Phobos Lieutenant, which makes that pair of combat blades of his just a little bit tastier, with +1 strength and AP and damage, should he end up in combat with one of the Incursor squads. His Shoot and Fade Phobos Lieutenant ability allows us some super mobility in that regard, and of course with the assault keyword on those Oculus Bolt carbines, movement is very easy indeed. The Hellfire round strat can make those rather standard strength 4 bolt carbines wound infantry on 2s regardless of what we're shooting at. Alternatively, with the lethal hits buff of the Lieutenant on one of those squads, we could use Kraken rounds instead to give any already auto-wounding crit hits an extra AP punch. Choices. Though perhaps the most powerful power play of all in this army is to take the Beacon Angelis on the Apothecary, because as if those Hell Blasters aren't buffed enough, we can also choose to keep them in reserve at the start and deep strike them as appropriate, with some free rapid ingress action thrown in to boot. So yeah, if my opponent moves a unit in their movement phase to a place I don't really like, assuming there's room, I can just drop 5 immortal supercharged plasma incinerators right in their face. And all of that is without really thinking too much about the actual detachment abilities. Sure, we don't technically have any kill teams here, but I know there'll definitely be use cases for giving stuff sustained hits, lethal hits, or precision keywords at strategic moments. I think it's pretty strong. So whilst this is one of those fun creative thought experiments that got a bit out of hand, it does actually work pretty well on the table, even if it looks a bit mad. It's also left me with a few options going forward, and I'll talk about how I can use some of this lot in combat patrol in my next video. Let me know what you think. Do you play Red Hunters or Deathwatch? How do you play them or represent them on the table? What are your thoughts on the Alpha Legion, or indeed Cypher? Are they coming back to aid or oppose the Imperium? Who can say? Anyway, hopefully I'll see you next time. And as ever, thanks for watching.
Let's go!
Yes, thanks for watching. Do give this video a like and a comment if you enjoyed the content, or indeed otherwise, as I do love to read your thoughts and ideas. As ever, this is just a bit of fun for me. I don't have a regular release schedule or Patreon or anything, so hit subscribe if this is something you'd like to see more of, and you can catch my content when it happens. Hopefully, I'll see you next time.